Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cracking Addiction. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and we have with us an esteemed and honoured guest, Suzanne Neilsen, who is a professor and deputy director of the Monash Addiction Research Centre. Susie, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And I wanted today to pick your brains on the nitazenes issue, because it's beginning to rear its ugly head in Australia. So first of all, what are nitazenes?
Well, the nitazenes are a family of drugs, a family of compounds. They all are opioids and they're all chemically related with a similar structure. And they tend to be relatively high potency opioids. So they came about originally through, pharmaceutical drug development in the 1950s. They were tested as, potential analgesics, and they didn't really progress much further along that drug development pathway. I think it emerged relatively early on that they were quite potent, and the side effect profile in terms of severe respiratory depression wasn't really ideal for a therapeutic agent. This family of compounds essentially has sat dormant in sort of patent literature for a number of decades before, being rediscovered and emerging in the illicit drug scene as synthetically manufactured opioids that are starting to cause really significant amounts of harm in the community.
So really what I'm hearing is nitazenes are a group of drugs that are synthetic opioids in the same way almost as fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. And they seem to be riding the quest of the synthetic opioid epidemic, the wave rather, in the opioid epidemic. So why do you think, so firstly, they sat dormant because of really there were concerns about the side effects and the narrow therapeutic window. So it was very easy to tip people into respiratory depression, as you say. So they were put to one side. Why were they reactivated, do you think?
So we've had this phenomenon over the past, 1 to 2 decades where we've had an increasing problem where they're often called NPS, novel psychoactive substances, which doesn't really mean anything other than that they're not currently controlled. So they could be from any, class of drug, but these are substances that mimic the effect of illicit drugs, but are often not controlled internationally. And so because of that, they often start to get a little bit of a hold in the market because people can manufacture them and sell them across borders, and they're not yet internationally illegal. So that can be quite attractive.
Yeah.
What we've seen with fentanyl is this manufacturing of fentanyl, and it's become sort of a drug of choice. And as the international laws have really clamped down on fentanyl and fentanyl analogues, we've started to see other synthetic opioids start to emerge and potentially may take their place. Although we still know in the US that fentanyl is the main opioid being used and causing mortality still, even though we've had the emergence of these other substances.
So it's driven by a desire to remain one step ahead of the law that will basically clamp down on the use of illegal opioids. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that, and also they're very potent substances. So when you have very potent substances, it's much easier to ship them internationally rather than shipping, kilos of a drug. You're shipping grams of a drug, and we know that often these are being shipped, just in envelopes, for example, as opposed to large packages. So getting around some of the detection that we might see with, traditional plant-based material because of the small volume.
Yeah. So a kilo of heroin, roughly, if we're talking about fentanyl, would be like 100 grams. And if we're talking about carfentanil, it would only be, like a gram or so. So what you're saying is a similar effect with the nitazenes. The equivalent of a kilo of heroin is literally only like a thimbleful of dust. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, very, very small amounts are very potent. Although one thing that I would say we know about the nitazenes is they're not all the same. So they have quite a variation in potency. Some of them are similar to sort of morphine. Some of them are many, many times more potent than fentanyl. And they also have quite a variation in their half-life. So some of them are actually quite long-acting. So that, again, can increase the danger of them.
Absolutely. So we're talking about a family of nitazenes. What's in the family? Mr. and Mrs. Nitazene have had many children. Who are these kids?
So one of the things that differs from fentanyl, I guess, to nitazenes is many of them are not particularly well characterised. We haven't seen a lot of studies about them because they're not used medically. So we know a little bit about a handful of them, and we see more of them emerging over time. Some of the ones that we've seen more of are isotretinoin, adenosine, metanidazine. And protonidazine. They're probably the more common ones, but we start to see a whole range of similar compounds emerging, and they're all slightly different, but they all
Yeah.
act like opioids in general, and are at least as potent as morphine, if not many, many
Mm.
more times potent.
Yeah, yeah. So then I suppose really if we're talking about the fact that the reason why they're so dangerous is because they have the ability to have side effects, opioid side effects. And what are those opioid side effects? What should people be looking out for?
The main concern that we have is respiratory depression. So,
Mm,
similar to what we see with heroin, and we know heroin itself can cause really significant overdoses. With these synthetic
mm,
opioids, including fentanyl and this family of nitazenes, they're
mm,
just many times more potent often. And one of the things
mm.
that means is that overdose states can be entered quite quickly. So we know often
Yes,
with
yes.
heroin, we've got quite a window of time to
Mm,
intervene. With
yeah.
fentanyl, and it's suspected with some of these nitazenes as well, they have quite a quick onset of action, and possibly only a few minutes to be able to intervene in an overdose. So that does make them more dangerous just in reducing that window to respond.
Yeah, and if the problem is that people who are when they're buying illicit drugs, they don't set out to actually buy nitazenes or they don't really know that there could be nitazenes in whatever it is they're buying illicitly, so they're not expecting a very rapid onset of a severe respiratory depression. So, I've read articles that suggest that the nitazenes are actually being used to lace cocaine, so you're expecting a stimulant, you're expecting a dopamine rush and a high, and you're ingesting something that's potentially lethal and is going to give you a hypnosedative overdose. So it's I suppose really, if you're going to take any illicit drug, you have to be aware of the risk that it could be laced with something that could kill you very quickly, and that you need the the antidote very quickly. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree. We definitely now need to be considering a much broader target audience for harm reduction with opioids because we
Mm,
have detected these nitazenes in a broad range of substances. So in Australia, for example, we've had MDMA that was contaminated with nitazenes.
yeah,
We've had ketamine that was contaminated with nitazenes. So
yeah,
the populations who are potentially at risk are much broader than our sort of
yeah,
heroin using population. We do
yeah.
know that there's a small number of people that do intentionally purchase nitazenes, but as you say, it seems like the majority of people don't necessarily know that they're using them. And then to pick up
Mm,
on this issue of contamination, we don't know exactly why nitazenes are turning up in drugs like MDMA, but I think the prevailing theory is that it's most likely accidental and contamination. And we know that where these drugs are often packaged up, for example, they're not pharmaceutical grade, drug manufacturing facilities where everything's cleaned and decontaminated. There are mistakes made. There's often sort of drugs left behind. And so that's the prevailing theory. It's got a sloppy drug dealer theory as to why we might be seeing these nitazenes appear, but we don't really know. And I don't think it would make very good business sense to be selling, cocaine with nitazenes in it. You're going to reduce your customer base very rapidly. So yeah, it's not entirely clear what's going on, but the danger remains the same nonetheless.
Well, that issue is equally relevant to the fentanyl and other compounds. I mean, why would you find fentanyl or sufentanil or carfentanil in stimulants? Is it all due to the sloppy drug dealer theory, or are there potentially other reasons why you might
Yeah,
choose to do that mixture?
it might be slightly different with fentanyl. We do know that it's very sedating, and so that there has been potentially people using stimulants and fentanyl to kind of counter some of those effects. But
Mm,
at the same time, we've seen both heroin with methamphetamine, traces of methamphetamine in it in Australia. We know we don't still
mm,
understand why that is. It's like the amounts are often sort of subtherapeutic. So why these drugs are necessarily being identified in there, we don't know. I think the issue for nitazenes is that because you need such a small amount to cause an overdose, then, where we might not normally know that there's contamination, it becomes quite clear when you have contamination with something that's just so toxic.
Right. And so the antidote to opioid-induced respiratory depression is naloxone. You're an expert on naloxone and the rollout of naloxone in Australia. So what are your thoughts on naloxone and how is it relevant to the nitazenes issue?
Well, it's definitely still relevant. We know that at the pharmacological level that naloxone can reverse the effect of nitazenes, and naloxone does competitively bind to the mu opioid receptor, and it will be effective in an overdose. Some of the data, and this is again very early data out of the UK, for example, suggests that the dose might need to be higher in some instances. And so, for example, Scottish colleagues were suggesting that they were using initial doses of maybe, or up to maybe 2 milligrams to reverse an overdose rather than sort of 400 micrograms, which is the standard kind of dose that we use in take-home naloxone. So, not many, many times higher, but, perhaps needing to have more than 1 or 2 doses on hand to effectively reverse an overdose.
And that's the same with fentanyl, isn't it? You might need higher than expected doses with fentanyl as well.
Look, yeah, it can be the same. But having said that as well, look, we've got data that suggests that often fentanyl overdoses are reversed with normal doses of naloxone. And so we wouldn't want to assume that you're going to need heroic doses. We'd still want some caution in terms of having a number of doses on hand. But, administering the dose, waiting a short while for a response, administering a second dose. We don't want to put people into very severe withdrawal either. That will make people very uncomfortable and it might even put people off using naloxone. So we still need to be, sensible in the approach, but definitely having naloxone on hand is going to be important. And thinking about some of the stock problems we've had in Australia with naloxone, that's something I think we might need to plan for, the volumes of naloxone that we might need to give out in harm reduction services rather than 2 doses at a time. Maybe we need to be giving 4 or 6 doses at a time so people have enough on hand. That's going to mean that we're going to need to stock more naloxone and, potentially make sure that we have more on hand in ambulances, in, ED departments. So it could really impact, if we have these clusters of nitazene overdoses, our ability to respond to them.
So really, nitazenes, they're synthetic opioids. Some of them are more potent than fentanyl, and they may require higher than expected amounts of naloxone to reverse. And they are accidental contaminants for effectively a wide range of drugs, including the stimulants. So if you're buying a stimulant, be aware and be cautious that it may be laced with a hypnosedative opioid, and wherever you go, keep some naloxone. Is that a fair summary of what we've discussed so far?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I mean, the other thing that we haven't discussed is, I guess, the emergence. And we're in the very early days of drug checking. We have, only 2 states of Australia that really have, a proper established, drug checking service. So we know Canberra has a fixed site service, and Queensland now has, I guess, sort of 2 services on the way. So if you happen to be lucky enough to live near one of those services, a really highly recommended thing to do if you're going to use illicit drugs is find out what's in them before you use them. But for most of Australia, that's just not an option right now.
Why is that? Is that political will or funding or?
Look, we've certainly seen a lot of political pushback in states like New South Wales and Victoria around drug checking. So we haven't seen services, a commitment or an establishment of services in those 2 states, despite seeing, really, relatively large number of deaths that could have been prevented by drug checking. And again, this threat of nitazenes and fentanyls and, it would seem like now is the time to really be developing up those services.
Right. So for anyone listening, lobby your MP. Is that what you're saying?
Look, I don't think it hurts to provide a voice of support around some of these evidence-based services that do often attract a little bit of controversy. I think it's
Yeah.
important that people know that
Yeah.
that professionals get behind these services because they work.
Yeah. They do. And it's not just about working. I think it's important to emphasize that harm reduction interventions, including such services as you've described, they save lives. People die otherwise. I think that's the key message for anyone
Right.
listening, isn't it?
Right, and we've seen evidence that when people test their drugs and find out that they do contain either
Mm.
unexpected or potentially toxic ingredients, that changes people's
Mm.
behaviour in a positive way. And as you say, it
Yeah.
provides that opportunity for a harm reduction discussion. It provides an opportunity for a discussion about naloxone, as you say, to a population that might not necessarily be thinking about opioid overdose. So it can be very powerful as a harm reduction tool.
Professor Neilsen, I want to thank you for your pearls of wisdom, as always, and I really do look forward to the next time we have the opportunity of chatting. But for now, thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure as always.
That's all for today, folks. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and this has been Cracking Addiction.